the story of Daniel. In the Bible we read of a king by the name of Darius, and he appointed 3 presidents over his kingdom. One of them was the man Daniel. Daniel's backstory is really interesting because he came into this kingdom as a captive. He was a Jew brought into Babylon as a captive, and he was trained to work in the king's service. But Daniel, like many of the Old Testament characters, had a gift for interpreting dreams and visions. And so Daniel became prominent and recognised. And the king recognised something special in Daniel and made him one of the 3 presidents over the land of Babylon. Some of the others in the land, as is often the case, were very jealous of Daniel. And so they tried to trick the king into making a law that said that no one was to worship any god except the king. The king agreed to that. But of course, Daniel was a faithful Jew, and he prayed every day to his God, the God of Israel. One day he was seen praying in his room, and it was reported to the king. The king had to fulfill the law that he made, and the punishment was that Daniel was to be thrown into a lion's pit. That night, Daniel prayed in the pit. And the miracle was that God shut the lion's mouth and Daniel was saved. The story tells us that the king was so upset that night he could barely sleep. He hurried the next morning down to the pit to see what had happened, and he was overjoyed to see that Daniel was still alive. There's a story that's often told, a legend of a persecuted Christian. He was being chased by soldiers that were under orders to put him to death. He found a cave and rushed in to hide. When the soldiers came to the cave, they saw a spider's web across the entrance and determined that the man couldn't have gone in there or the web would have been broken at the entrance. Hours later, when the believer came out of the cave, he walked into the web and realised why the soldiers hadn't looked for him there. He said, "Where God is not, a wall is but a spider's web. Where God is, a spider's web is as a wall." God had saved the believer. God had saved Daniel. Story about God's faithfulness to God's people. God is always there for his people. We don't always get rescued the way we want to. Things don't always work out the way we hope. But the story reminds us of God's faithfulness in all situations and in all times, and especially when we're going through tough times, times of trial. God is faithful to us, and we are asked, like Daniel, to remain faithful to God, to continue to pray, to continue to wait for God's presence with us in those times. Story reminds us that earthly kingdoms come and go. King Darius's kingdom came and went. But God's kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and he calls us to allegiance to his kingdom, not to earthly powers. As we reflect on the story of Daniel, may we again be reminded of God's faithfulness. Amen.